Bagent,
Here.
Clegg,
Here.
Halliburton,
Here.
Sanchez, Thompson,
Here.
Woodings.
Here.
5 present, 1 absent.
Madam Mayor, we can't hear you.
Mic is on. Huh.
We'll request IT assistance. Yes.
Can you, yeah, this one's working. Okay. So I'm going to turn this one off. All right, sounds like my mic wasn't working. So first up, we have Maria Wieg from our Office of Community Engagement to present language access strategy for the next year. And just to kick this off, Maria, I think, oh yeah, I see you, Maria. Thanks for joining us. One of our goals, the council and I shared the goal of in the last year of coming up with a way to make sure that more of our materials were available to more people. And so Maria and the team in CE, Community Engagement, has worked on a process for what we do first and how we get to the point where we can support as many languages as possible and necessary within our community. So Maria, go ahead. You can go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm going to share my screen. And if you all could let me know if you can see that.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So kind of starting out, sorry, it's on a different screen than what my video camera is. So starting out with the first part of our mission statement, the City of Boise will create a city for everyone by embracing our community in the decision-making process. And that really compels us to respond to what our community will find most impactful. And that's everything from being able to access some of our vital services, applying for business licenses, coming in and paying a parking ticket, paying a utility bill, to enjoying our programs, getting information that we're putting out that's important to the community, all the way to fully engaging and participating in the important conversations that we're having around the future of our community. So that's kind of what we kept in mind in thinking about a language access program. So language access programs across the country recognize the value of diversity within our community. And Boise clearly has a growing diverse community and is enriched by that, both culturally and economically, ensuring equitable access to all of our vital services, and providing meaningful opportunities for engagement, which is really what we're here and what we're all about today. So what I would mention to all of you is this really moves us beyond just compliance. We're doing the compliance piece really well. We've checked all the boxes. We've got it up on the website. We're doing a good job with the I Speak cards and with translating some of our most vital documents. But we really need to go to the next level to make sure that we're responding to the needs of our community and making sure that we're providing information in the languages and ways of communicating that our community is asking for. So if you look at where we are sitting currently in the city of Boise, and this is information most recently from the census. I think we will see that this shift a little bit when we get the most recent census results in just a couple of months. 89.9% of our community is English only, 4.7 Spanish, and then other languages kind of fall lower below that. And just for everyone's situational awareness, the 2 languages that we see the need for most clearly at City Hall as we've looked across all of our different departments, Sierra and HR did a really good kind of cataloging last year, a couple of years ago, on what we're seeing across our city departments are Farsi and Swahili for a couple of particular services that we provide. So the census estimates that only about 3.4% of Boise residents speak English less than very well. But among limited English speakers, that percentage ranges from between 28 and 47%. So we want to make sure that we're really responding to the needs of the community, making sure that we're providing the language access that our community needs. And it's not just limited to folks who are limited English proficiency speakers. We're also talking about folks in the deaf and hard of hearing community. That was harder for me to chase down current information. But I think we're looking at about roughly 13,000 folks in our community right now who are deaf and hard of hearing and could use additional language access services when they're trying to engage with the city. So what does building a language access program look like? We've done a good amount of work to date. It's been primarily on the compliance side. I want to give a big shout out to HR for doing a lot of work in 2019 to make sure that we were really in compliance, that we're cataloging our resources. And through the course of that, we were able to build sort of a list of bilingual staff members who were willing to be called upon in the event that we needed some interpretation services. We've got a list of translators that we use. Different departments are doing different levels of language access. BPD is doing a pretty good job of making sure that they're responding to folks in the language they need to be responded to. But we don't yet quite have a really cohesive, really proactive way of understanding how we treat language access at the city. So when we talk about language access, we're talking about translation for documents, interpretation for folks who come in trying to access services and have limited English proficiency or are deaf and hard of hearing, and then any adaptive technologies that can help facilitate that. So in 2020, we kind of picked up where the initial work left off, the compliance work left off. We had some budget allocation for translation work, some one-time budget allocation. I know you have Eric next, and he'll want to make sure that I recognize that that was a one-time budget allocation. We've put together a team with Mary Grant from legal, folks from CE, folks from IPT, and HR to research best practices, look at what our sister cities are doing, reach out to folks across the country who build these programs successfully. And then we've started working on an updated policy and an updated regulation to really guide us through this, with the goals of focusing on what the community needs. What are the vital documents that really are sort of the baseline for what we need to be providing translation for? And then what do we need to go a little bit above and beyond to engage and support? And it became really clear when we started looking at the one-time budget allocation and thinking about it just in terms of translation, that one, it wouldn't go terribly far, and two, we might end up spending really valuable resources on the kinds of documents and the kinds of things that weren't necessarily what would be the most impactful to the community. At which point we took a step back and said, it's time to go out and really ask, not make a lot of assumptions, but make sure that we're providing what the community needs and will use and will improve the ability of folks to engage with us. And we want to be really consistent and strategic with our resources, right? We want to be able to answer the question, well, why do you translate this but not this? Why is this done proactively but somebody else has to look for this? So it's incumbent upon us to make sure as a city that we're predictable for folks and welcoming at the same time.
Madam Mayor,
Yes, go
may I
ahead.
just ask a question real quick, Maria? One thing that I've noticed in being in City Hall and kind of seeing how the public interacts at the front desk with kind of our business licensing staff there is that maybe they would also have some really interesting insight on where translation services might be more useful. Have they been engaged at all in kind of defining and scoping out this work?
Yep, they sure have, and they're a big part of our next steps. So the work Sierra did in 2019 really did catalog across the city what kind of programs and services we were getting the most requests for from folks with limited English proficiency. So we have a good sense of that, and that's where we have the sense of Farsi and Swahili and the I Speak languages. We're also, a lot of the departments across the city are using Language Line, which allows you to kind of call up and get somebody who can be an interpreter. It's a little hit or miss in terms of who you get on the other end of the line, but that's been a good measure to help increase our ability to provide those services.
Wonderful, thank you.
So the next step would be taking it up to this next level, to bring before you a language access policy that can be passed by council resolution, which really formalizes and allows us to start operationalizing a language access program within the city, something consistent, something predictable, and based on the needs of the community. So after we had that, after we would have that policy passed by resolution, we would launch into a really formal needs assessment. Councilmember Whittings, that would include reaching out to the folks who are on the front lines, who are interacting with our community members every day. It would be working with community partners and having conversations with the folks who need these services the most and saying, what is most impactful? Is it a city council agenda? Is it not a city council agenda? Is it something, you know, is it something else? Is it the services that we're continuing to provide on demand, making sure that we have forms in our most commonly spoken languages, and then make sure that people know how to access on-demand services. We want to make sure that we're responding to what people really need, will really use, and will most improve their ability to engage with us. And then we would build on the existing LEP plan that's in place and that's available on our website. So we would look into data collection. What data do we need to be collecting? We've already started making sure that we're coding our translation interpretation services consistently across the city, so we can see what we're currently spending across the board. Identification of those resource needs. What do we really need? At what point do we hit the threshold that triggers? There's a federal threshold of about 5% that tends to trigger sort of another level of language access. I think we will likely get there with Spanish with the next census. We're a bit shy of it right now. Staff training to make sure across the city we understand how to best access those resources and what the best practices are. And then communication, once we've got some of that in place, communication back to the impacted communities, the organizations, the folks that we work with, to let them know, you know, what we're doing and how it's working. And then making sure that we have a really good feedback loop, that it's an iterative process, and that we're constant, that we're reevaluating in a timely way. I think best practices are every 3 to 5 years reevaluating the program to make sure that it's serving the needs of the community in a way that's meaningful and impactful, and isn't just something that kind of sits on a shelf that we do for the sake of doing it. So it's very quick. Next steps, there's been, you know, a good chunk of work that has been done, both on the compliance side and from folks who are thinking about how to do this well from a legal perspective and from a community engagement perspective. And we're just looking to formalize it and make it a part of the practice of what we do with the city.
Madam Mayor.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Maria. That's a wonderful presentation. So I just wanted to share some information with you to just put in your quiver here as you move forward with this. You know, as somebody who is bilingual, I've had wonderful doors of employment open to me simply because of that fact. But Spanish isn't my first language. English is my first language, but in a community where we do have the largest minority population being the Latino community, it has helped me. But I have to say, one area which I don't think folks take into consideration, at least not in Idaho yet, other communities do, is they take into consideration that oftentimes when someone is bilingual, they are pulled away from their main job to serve in that role. And so what that does is, yes, as an organization, we're able to provide improved services to our community, which is wonderful. But unfortunately, it can sometimes have an adverse effect on the employee if that is not the specific job that they were hired to do. So in those communities, what you have is an understanding that this is an additional task that an employee is willing to do, which is wonderful. But then we have to take that into consideration during performance evaluation time if they're not meeting their other goals, or are we willing to offer a pay differential to compensate folks who are bringing that added value to what we offer at the City of Boise. So I just wanted to point that out. Also, sometimes we make assumptions if somebody is a bilingual person, the level of fluency. I know for myself, I grew up raised by my grandmother who taught me Spanish, but who never went to school a day in her life. And so the Spanish I learned was from somebody born in 1915. So it was very obsolete and archaic. Thank goodness I made wonderful friends in college and was assisted in improving my Spanish. But with each industry that I joined, I had to learn a whole new set of terminology in English, and then do it in Spanish, because my grandmother did not teach me the word sexual harassment in Spanish. By the way, it's hostigamiento sexual, just in case you're wondering. And so just to keep that in mind, that when you have an employer approaching you, knowing that you do have that skill, we need to honor whether somebody wants to share that. And it's hard when you feel the pressure of an employer putting you on the spot. I've been in that position myself, and it's just this understanding that having fluency in one language, you may not have it at the same level in the other. So if you were to ask me to translate something from Spanish to English, easy breezy, no problem. If you want me to translate something from let's see, was it English to Spanish? From Spanish to English, it's harder. It's so strange. It's because my vocabulary is much larger in English than it is in Spanish. So I just want to bring out these little nuances to consider as we move forward, that if you have an employee who you know to be bilingual, but who may be resistant to offering this skill, it may be because they just want to give you a quality product and they may not be at that fluency level. So thank you for hearing me out, Maria, and thank you for bringing this to us.
Thank you, Council Pro Tem. I mean, that is something that is, as we look across what we're currently doing at the city, has been on our minds a lot. We do have a list of employees that have graciously volunteered, but also recognize that that isn't always a great solution for a number of reasons for the employees, but also for the person seeking the service, right? If that employee isn't available at that kind of moment in time. So that's why we want to do like a really thorough needs assessment and evaluation of the resources that are necessary, because we recognize that this is a very kind of multi-layered piece. I should also mention, because you mentioned vocabulary, one of the things that we've started doing is trying to build in the time that once we have a translation done, and we have wonderful translators, once we have a translation done, we oftentimes have also sought out additional native Spanish speakers to read through the translation, just to kind of make sure we've gotten some of the make sure that we've gotten the terminology right? Because everybody translates, and we have a lot of wonky stuff sometimes that we try to translate. And so, one, in the goal of trying to move away from using wonky language generally, but two, trying to make sure that we're translating words in a way that are really understandable to a native speaker. We've been trying to add that layer in too, just as an extra check to be as resident focused as we can.
Maria, I'm so glad to hear that that's being taken into consideration, because as you know, I think my colleagues and we have at times asked for less, as you put it, wonky language in hearing our presentations. And so imagine adding another layer of having that be in a different language. So thank you so much for being mindful about that.
Madam Mayor.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Maria, this is great. Glad to hear it. I have a question about how we're, during the needs assessment, we're going to include partners such as the school district and refugee services organizations, and internally, of course, our police department. so that we can make the best use of everyone's resources and not duplicate. You're still muted. Did you hear me?
I did. I'm sorry, Council President. I
Okay, we're
didn't catch
having
the
trouble
question.
with the
So
microphones.
I have a question. Could you all hear the council president or no? Oh, you could, but it looks like Maria couldn't. Okay.
I heard the first part, but not the question. I'm sorry.
Okay, the question was, how are we going to work with all of those partners so we don't duplicate services and resources?
And that's really our next step. One, I think we're exploring working with some folks who do this around the country and have good experience to make sure that we take everything into consideration. And then we'll be working closely with each of our departments and with the organizations we've built conversations with, and really just map out who's doing what, where is it overlapping, are there places we can find some economies of scale. Some of that's probably going to be working with Eric and his team to see where we have overlapping budget expenditures on different kinds of pieces to make sure that we look for that. But we in the course of this have met some really great folks with a lot of specialized experience in this. And we want to make sure that we get something really right-sized for Boise. And that's why we're going to be taking both an internal and external approach to map what's out there, get a sense of what's really needed, and come back with something that's comprehensive, cohesive, and predictable.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor?
Sure. We'll take one more, and then I just need us to be mindful of time because we have a presentation on our general fund revenue projections up next.
Thank you, and I can make this real quick. Thanks for bringing this forward. I just wanted to make sure that when we're doing that needs assessment, if we're looking at policy, that we're also maybe investigating different things like speeches that might be important that Mayor McLean or other council members are giving. I think about some of our emergency orders that we put out and how that might have been nice in the future if we could have find a way to make sure that we can translate stuff like that as well. So that might just be something that we examine when we do that needs assessment. That's all I got.
Thank you, council member. We actually did make sure that we had a version of the state of the city that was captioned in Spanish. And with each of our emergency orders, we've gotten those translated as well and made sure that they were on the website. And we have started, particularly with our utility billing inserts, doing one side in English and one time in Spanish, because we tend to communicate very service related kinds of things on the utility billing insert. But thank you for that. And always point out opportunities for us because we like to rise to the occasion.
Well, thank you, Maria, very much. Appreciate it. And more to come. All right, next up we have, I see Eric has jumped in the Zoom room. Hi, Eric. Eric is with us tonight to talk about some projections. So this is the beginning really of the budget process and presentations and work with council. And so we have this time scheduled now to talk about some forecasting that Eric and the team and financial services and budgeting have done. And then I think that we're scheduled for an additional conversation in the next couple of weeks on likely expenses. So we've asked Eric to come tonight and outline the thinking and reasonings and assumptions behind some of the forecasts that he is working with right now based on the budget needs we'll have and the expectations that he's saying. And of course, this budget, I want to be clear for the public too. You know, as you'll remember from last year, we start these conversations in January, February, and it's these early conversations about projections and expectations that will guide the decisions that we make around the property tax levy and increase or holding steady. And of course that impacts the ability to provide services in the community. So all that between now and our end of June budget workshop will start. So thanks, Eric, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Mayor, members of the council. And I guess just to reiterate as I get into this, I do view this as, you know, the beginning of a multi-month dialogue that we're going to be having. And as I go through some of these assumptions, I hope that they really do start to set the stage for subsequent discussions and conversations on budget priorities and strategies. The hope would be that today, as we're going through this, that we kind of focus on the revenues, and I am going to hit a few expenditure areas, and then allow space over the coming weeks and months for us to get into budget priorities, new investments, policy as it relates to certain revenue streams and things of that nature. So what I'm calling today is something of a baseline. So we'll set something for us to compare against as we embark down this path. So the first thing I want to, do a little level setting is that I think this forecast, as we get into it, is going to look different than the forecast that was discussed at length during the summer and last year's budget process. And that's really for several factors. So the first thing is to think back to when we established the 5-year forecast last year. We were in a period of uncertainty as it related to COVID. While we're certainly not out of the woods yet, we did not necessarily know how long COVID would be with us, how deep the implications would be, and how the economy would behave. So now with a year under our belt, we've been able to assess each of our revenue categories and gain a better understanding of the implications of COVID. The second thing is when we developed the forecast last go around, we still had the national election in front of us. And with, every national election cycle brings some level of economic uncertainty and instability. So we kind of had that built into our projections. Now that we're on the other side of the election, that's one less variable for us to have within our more immediate window. Some of our more significant revenue categories have seen improvement. Sales tax and development fees, I'll get into those. We've seen lower expenses, or I'm projecting lower expenses in certain areas. Insurance and software maintenance costs, again, I'll get into those in the presentation. Savings from reduced general employee salary growth. There was an amount built in as a reduction into the fiscal year 21 budget. There was even a lower amount that was allocated to general employees as part of this past budget cycle. So we have ensuing savings in our 5-year plan. We also had allocated, as part of the fiscal year 21 budget, $800,000 for workload initiatives. So new headcount and things of that nature to respond to a growing city. And the way that those needs have been met is by repurposing vacancies and reshuffling things a bit. And then the other thing that we have in this forecast that will be different is the full employment of position level budgeting. So we described last go around that we were going to a more granular approach to how we budget for our positions. We were able to do that as part of the fiscal year 21 budget for all of our general employees or non-police and fire contract employees. Going forward, we'll have that for all of our police and fire contract employees, again, allowing for a higher level of granularity and sophistication in our budget build. Also, just, as a disclaimer and point out that the numbers that we're going to go through in the baseline forecast is, in my mind, preliminary. I view kind of the budget development process as an iterative one. So as we get more and more data, we make more and more refinements, we'll hone in closer and closer to what the fiscal year 22 budget should be. But we have accounted for in this forecast what we believe, the very significant swings, the very significant variances and updated costs. So, we've made projections for all of our revenues based on what we think the economy will look like. We've made adjustments for all of our expenditures, personnel and non-personnel. And really the goal of this exercise and what we're working on and towards will be to eliminate dramatic swings one way or the other in our revenues and our expenditures. And again, to provide the city council with a baseline for comparison. We do know that there is legislative pieces that are being considered right now that could significantly change the general fund glide path, most prominently around property taxes. So while we have made every attempt to try and eliminate or reduce major swings over the next few months, that will be one that we'll have to be monitoring very closely, and as I'll get into, could quite significantly change the projections. And then I mentioned previously the position level budgeting for our contract employees. So at a high level, I just kind of want to go through what the economic assumptions that I've built into this forecast are. So the first is, COVID. So as I mentioned, we have, some more experience around, what the implications of COVID are. We also are now in an environment where the vaccine is starting to get rolled out. We feel, that we have a higher degree of certainty as to how this could play out than we did last year at this time. So the underlying assumption here is that by the end of this calendar year, from an economic standpoint, the underlying assumption is that by the end of this calendar year, we will largely be out of the position of facility closures, limited in-person events, extreme social distancing, and significant COVID-related expenditures. We have built in an assumption that there could be a recessionary impact from the environment that we're in fiscal year 22, and then we would see accelerating growth in subsequent fiscal years. Interesting, today there was a forecast released by the Congressional Budget Office that basically projected accelerating growth in future years as well. So in that table, you can see, we build in, we do a Monte Carlo scenario as one of the ways that we kind of come up with our projections. You can see on the right, we do a Monte Carlo in addition to trend analysis, regional forecasts, national forecasts, budget office research, talking to different folks. But in that Monte Carlo scenario, we've built in the highest probability of a recession in the early portion of this 5-year forecast, with a declining probability in the subsequent years. So I'll now go through our revenues, and I'll focus on our major revenue categories. So the first one is obviously property tax, which makes up approximately 2/3 of general fund revenues. A theme that we've talked about a lot in recent years has been the ongoing shift of the property tax burden from commercial properties to residential properties. That burden shift continues, and we expect it to continue into the future. The other thing that we have is in fiscal year 21, there were a few measures that are going to place upward pressure and strain on that burden shift that we've been talking about. So the first one is the Governor's Public Safety Grant Initiative program. So that was the program that provided city funding to the city through federal coronavirus relief funds to be passed on to the community in exchange for lower property tax growth rate. And that came to the city by way of a reimbursement for public safety related expenses. That was a 1-year program. So when community members received their property tax bill back in November, it was quite a bit lower than it otherwise would have been absent that program. So with that program essentially retiring and going away, we would expect to see property bills on a year-over-year basis increase just by virtue of the fact that that program is going away. You'll recall that as part of the fiscal year 2021 process, the Boise City Council approved a 0% base increase. And then we do anticipate when the county assessor's office is has completed their work on the assessments, that we will see continued burden shift. You know, we've seen in the market residential properties continue to appreciate at a very rapid rate. At the same time, you know, commercial properties, we've seen vacancies and all the other factors that were leading to that burden shift that I spoke about at the beginning of this slide. So as we go through this, you know, I've built in certain assumptions, and these assumptions will be challenged and be worked, you know, be adjusted throughout the course of this budget cycle. But as a starting point, we've assumed 3% annual increases for the sake of comparison and just providing something. So as we go through the process, I will be providing scenarios that will show various impacts of lower growth, various impacts of legislation, and things of that nature. My baseline forecast assumes the full value of projected new construction and annexation. I have not assumed any use of foregone property tax revenue. So you'll recall that as part of last year's budget process, when the City Council approved a 0% base growth level for property tax, that essentially left $4.8 million in eligible property tax receipts that were not taken. The City Council declared that as foregone, reserving the right in future years to take that. I have not assumed any of that as part of this process, nor have I assumed any negative impacts from statewide legislation. We have, you know, at least, you know, a couple months of, you know, the legislative session to go. And as we get more information, as anything is approved, passed, we will, you know, model various impacts. And then the last thing is there is a urban renewal district that is scheduled to retire in the last year of this 5-year forecast. So the River Myrtle Old Boise Urban Renewal District is going to reach the end of its 20-year term. And we should expect to see a bump in our property tax revenue as that district sunsets. So I've built that into my forecast. Just a quick overview of some of the significant drivers for year-over-year changes as it relates to city collections. At the gross level, you know, obviously the annual base growth that is built in, the level of new construction and annexation that is added to the tax rolls, and then, as previously mentioned, the retirement of urban renewal districts. The drivers for year-over-year changes on individual bills do look a little bit different. The rate of growth in the assessed value for any one property relative to other property owners is a significant driver as to what the individual will be billed. Also, the amount of assessed value that's subject to taxation. So as residential properties in particular increase, more and more of their value is subject to taxation due to the diminishing value of the homeowner's exemption, which was capped at $100,000 back in 2016. I talked about the one-time property tax relief program, and then the other element is, you know, any change in local taxing entity budgets, which does have an implication on property tax bills. Moving on to sales tax, our baseline forecast is improved as compared to the June 2020 forecast. We've seen year-over-year growth throughout this pandemic on a quarterly basis at the statewide level for sales tax. So whereas we had built in some pretty steep declines in the 5-year forecast, when we built it last summer, we've now seen that even through the pandemic, COVID on its own hasn't resulted in significant property tax, or excuse me, sales tax reductions. The other thing I'll mention is that there was legislation that was approved at the statewide level in the last legislative session that effectively capped the city of Boise's growth in sales tax at 1% per year. And that's because the city of Boise was higher than the average per capita distribution of other cities. And there was a statewide attempt to level out the distribution of sales tax proceeds. We've been above that distribution level, therefore we're capped at that 1% growth amount. And I've assumed 1% growth throughout the 5-year forecast. So you can see what that looks like. And I have several slides that have this similar view. On the left-hand side, you can see historical growth, and there was pretty steady growth in the sales tax category. The orange category orange bar representing our fiscal year 21 projections. Fiscal year 22, right to the right of that is the second orange bar, and then the outer year forecast in gray. And you can see on the table to the right that fiscal years 22 through 26, I've assumed that 1% growth. So definitely a leveling off of growth within this category.
Madam Mayor. Eric, just a point on this. The legislation last year based the distribution on the nighttime population, in other words, the number of residents that live in your city, and did not take into account the daytime population. So not just Boise, but many cities that see an increase in daytime population were impacted in this way. Just a little further explanation.
Thank you very much. That's a good point. As we look at sales tax, or excuse me, liquor tax, you can see the growth within that category that it existed, between 2010, 2020. Interestingly, in fiscal year 20, our growth was a little bit higher than it had been in prior years due to consumption patterns. As more and more people were purchasing liquor for home consumption, we actually saw statewide growth in liquor sales, which correlated to increased collections at the citywide level. You can see on the right-hand side of this chart, 6.3% growth in fiscal year 20 from fiscal year 2019. I've effectively shown it being flat for the next couple of years. That's again due to statewide legislation, which has diverted a portion of liquor tax sales to the counties to support magistrate court services. There's a corresponding expenditure reduction for the city of Boise, and that legislation had a 5-year ramp-up period. So at the end of that ramp-up period, we've assumed normal growth continuing within this category. For our development fees, which is one of the more volatile categories, you can see, kind of ups and downs historically. You can see that fiscal year 2020 was down from fiscal year 2019. We are expecting to see, or we've built in this category some reductions in fiscal years 22 and 23, with growth picking up in the outer years of that forecast. I'll note that within this category, while we have built in a level of reduction from fiscal year 20 activities, this does represent an improvement from the June 2020 forecast. As an example of that, in that forecast for fiscal year 22, we had 9.4 million. In this forecast, we have 11.2 million within fiscal year 22. Franchise fees has been a category that, while there has been variances between each of the individual fees, gas, garbage, cable TV, and water, collectively, they've been relatively flat for the better part of 10, 15 years. We expect that to continue. We've built in growth of approximately 1.2% in the outer years of the forecast. And then departmental revenue, which is revenue that is, directly attributable to services provided within the departments. We have built in an improvement in fiscal year 22, a slight improvement as compared to fiscal year 21. That fiscal year 21 amount represents the adopted budget that you'll recall as part of the end of year process in our end of year report, which we brought for council consideration and approval back in December. We actually lowered our estimates for parking and parks and recreation departmental revenue. You can see that the most significant departmental revenue source we have is public safety. That represents reimbursement from the airport, Boise State University, and then various fire districts for services provided on their behalf. Parks and recreation are the things you typically think about when you think about parks and recreation revenues: golf, Idaho Ice World, the zoo, recreational programs, things of that nature. We've built in increases in each year to account for the cost of providing those services, with an improvement beginning in fiscal year 23. Again, harking back to my previous mentions about the recessionary environment that we've allowed for within this forecast. So one of the things that comes up often, and when we look at these numbers, is, it is true that governmental agencies often feel the impacts of a recession later than the economy at large, or then the economy at large, and we would see improvement last. So the question that I wanted to kind of walk through is, why isn't there more of a recovery lag built into this forecast? So if we're thinking that, we'll be maybe in a recessionary environment or coming out of COVID in fiscal year 22, why are these numbers improved as compared to the prior forecast, and why isn't there more of a lag? So I'll kind of walk through each of the individual revenue categories. So property tax, that one is because our gross receipts at the city level are not dependent upon values. So as property values increase or decrease, there's a levy rate that adjusts. We've also seen, timely payments. We had built in some allowance for delinquencies that has not come to fruition, at least as of yet, as it relates to property tax. Sales tax, we've seen improvement, as compared to prior forecasts. I mentioned that we continue to see statewide growth in migration into the Treasure Valley, into the state, and relatively strong employment as compared to national metrics. And I did mention the 2020 legislation capping growth at 1%. Liquor tax, I won't belabor that point. I talked a little bit about the personal consumption and how we might see some small marginal decline once restaurants begin operating at or near capacity levels and consumption patterns change. Franchise fees, largely unimpacted by the economic environment. Development fees are a category that are sensitive to the economic climate. We have built in some drops, but because last year's forecast, we assumed probably deeper declines than we anticipate realizing, this forecast represents an improvement. Departmental revenue, half of our approximately $28 million that we collect in departmental revenue comes from reimbursements for public safety and legal expenses. Those expenses are largely unimpacted by the economic climate. Within the parking category, we do anticipate some minor impacts, but those impacts, we expect to be minimized due to conservative forecasting in our prior forecast. Within parks and recreation, we expect to see some variances by category, but some of those variances partially offset by increased fees to keep up with the cost of providing services. I'll do a quick expenditure overview. As we look at expenditures in total, personnel makes up about 70% of overall, planned expenses. M&O or non-personnel about 18%, 17%. Miscellaneous, which is equipment, transfers at about 11%. When we look at that 71% for personnel, approximately 60% of that is for salaries, with the other 40% for health, retirement, and other benefits. And then citywide, as we look at planned expenses, public safety at about 55% of total planned expenses, with all other departments representing about 45%. For our maintenance and operations category, we've included an assumption that there will be continued right sizing. So you'll recall that as part of the fiscal year 20 budget process, there was a $1.4 million savings that was realized by aligning budgeted levels with historical spending patterns. We're continuing to do that review and continuing to look back, and we think that there's an opportunity for another $800,000 in right sizing our non-personnel budgets. And that will work out nicely. It will allow for growth in some of our higher growing expenditure categories, insurance and software maintenance, without dramatically increasing our overall M&O spend. So as we look at insurance, you can see the pattern in blue. You can see on the right-hand side of that bar chart, the orange represents our prior forecast, with the blue immediately to the left of the orange representing our current forecast. And you can see that our current forecast for insurance costs is lower than the prior forecast. And that's really the result of investments that the City Council has approved the last couple of years as part of the end of year process. When we closed out the books for fiscal year 2020 back in December, the City Council approved a $2 million allocation to help fortify our insurance funds. That, in conjunction with previous and one-time investments, has allowed us to lower our rate of growth, or projected rate of growth, for insurance expenses. Software maintenance is the other category that we frequently talk about as being a high growth area. We have assumed a slightly lower level of growth within this category in this forecast period as compared to the prior one. That's attributable to many things. I'll point out the work that IT and various finance department staff have done together to try to catalog expenses, try to avoid duplicative services, and IT has a dedicated resource working to help slow this rate of growth and ensure that we get the most bang for our buck as it comes to our software maintenance costs. So I'm just going to do a quick summary, talk about next steps, and open it up for questions. So in total, our baseline forecast, which I will be presenting bottom line numbers and projected net positions throughout the course of this budget process, does assume some level of funding for workload needs and market rate adjustments. It includes funding for the Northwest Fire Station, which we're projecting within this 5-year window, the operating costs associated with that. This baseline forecast assumes funding for additional police officers, which has been a longstanding priority of the council and has been included in prior forecasts. As it comes to growth rates for contract and general employees, we've assumed the historical growth rates for general employees, which is generally that 3% through a merit-based system, and then for contract employees, We've assumed the contractually negotiated terms through the duration of their contracts, and then a return to more historical growth levels in the subsequent years. We have not built in any allowance at this time for a potential increase to the federal minimum wage. For our maintenance and operation assumptions, I mentioned the continued right sizing to align budgets with historical spending patterns and the allowances for growth in insurance and software maintenance. For our cash flow reserve, as the budget grows, we anticipate, putting aside an amount to maintain that 8% of budgeted expense level that the City Council has set a goal for. And then we've set our contingencies at the historical budgeted levels. So again, I'll be returning throughout this budget process with various iterations and policy discussions about many elements related to this forecast. Before I go on to next steps, I'll just kind of give a high level as to where things stand right now. Under this baseline assumption, we have assumed that we will be in a positive position in all 5 years of the general fund forecast. That being said, under some of the statewide legislation that's being considered, if it were to be approved, we would turn that 180 degrees on its head and we would be in a negative position. So as we continue to monitor the legislative session and the discussions around property taxes, that will be one of the elements that I'll be coming forward to the City Council as we go through this process to outline implications and talk through how we might respond. In general, the process overview I've shown, on this slide from winter through summer, we're developing the baseline forecast in the period between now and June, as the mayor was alluding to, when we do our budget workshops and hearings and budget adoption. We're going to be doing a lot of forecast refinement, having policy discussion on our capital improvement program, potential new expenditures and revenues, including property tax, to really determine what goes into that proposed budget, some level of public engagement, and then again, monitoring and responding to the state legislative session. That's kind of my high level overview. I'd be happy to stand for any questions or clarifying comments.
Madam Mayor?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, one very quick question. Eric, thanks a lot for this. Does this current forecast keep us on track to meet our aggressive, and I support the aggressive parks schedule for green ups and new maintenance and such for parks?
Thank you for that question. As we go through this, I will be presenting various scenarios as it relates to our capital improvement plan, but I have not built into your question specifically. I haven't built in any changes to the planned general fund transfer to our capital program. So all of our planned green ups and new parks that were in the plan would be unimpacted by this. To the degree that the property tax situation changes, there is an alignment or some relationship between the general fund and the capital fund, and that could become an impact. But as of right now, no.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor.
Go ahead.
Eric, two quick things. When you come back to us, it would be good to know how many employees we do have that are below that $15 an hour proposed baseline for minimum wage. Would also, I'm assuming that the forecast as it stands includes the full 5% for VRT.
That is correct, Councilmember. Yes.
Thank you.
All right. It looks like that's it right now. Eric, thank you very much for joining us this evening with this presentation. Look forward to continued conversations and to discuss. When did you say you're coming back with us next? Is it?
We don't currently scheduled, but I think it would probably be, later in the month of February, early March.
Okay, great. Well, we will see you then. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And with that, we'll adjourn, we'll recess for half an hour and then be back. Thanks all.